Thank you so much. Let me just get the tech worked out here. Here, let's try that. Oh, yeah, that's not good. Sorry. That's a really awesome slide. So maybe we'll keep that up. OCM ACIA, Andrea Reimer, Quian Sana, Ansholaten, Tena Chen Tala, East Vancouver, Renfrew Collingwood, Chinquimon, Tahomusquium, Etas Squamish, Etas Swalatuth, Ohomeho, Quisotes to Ends, Hudson Squallowin, Quins Quachnomiat, Paichka. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Reimer. I am all the things that you heard said about me. Well, some of them I guess you'll find out as I talk. But what I was saying in the Squamish language is that I'm a settler here. I come from East Vancouver. I'm very grateful to the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people for the welcome that they give me here. And also to say, one of my favorite phrases since I've been learning Squamish is this phrase, Hudson Squallowin. So it basically means if you took, so they have a word for heart, which is Squallowin, which is, in English, we have like a word for the muscle that is also supposed to mean the feeling. In Squamish, there is only, the word Squallowin is just the word for the feeling of heart. So if you took all of the feelings of all of the things that you could see from wherever you are, that's how much feeling I have for the chance that we have to get together here today. And I don't say that lightly. In politics is really not a place where being female is valued, right? Politics is about power. Women don't have power, and therefore reminding people that you're female automatically diminishes the amount of power you have. Reminding them you're a mother reminds them that you have ovaries, a womb, and probably are female, and therefore should not have power in that room. So it is really quite awesome just to come and to be Andrea, to be a woman, to be a mother in the space. And I was told I could talk to you about anything I wanted to today, which is a super dangerous thing to do with an elected official. So what I thought I really wanted to talk to you about, though, was this ability just to be. And then Tess throws it down that is actually this important thing that we should be considering. As you heard from her, it can be hard just to be who we are, right? Just to be us. Even harder, I think, than that is to just let others be who they are. It's one of the reasons it's hard just to be us, right? The talk that was referred to, I was talking about, it was pretty early on in my kid coming out as transgender. It's going to make me cry again to go back to that time. It's tough having, you're all moms, you get this. It's tough having a kid that the world can't see for who they are. It's tougher still knowing that child, because of this difference, is super vulnerable. And even tougher to know that you as a parent, your job is not to wrap them up in bubble wrap, it's to let them go, right? It's to try and fight for the space for them to be safe, but not to hold on to them. My kid was 15 when they came out. If they were 6 months old, yes, I could have held on to them and that would have been okay. But I had a teenager who was out there trying to make space for themselves. All teenagers just want to be seen for who they are, right? We still want to be that. When you're transgender, gender binary, that much harder to do. My favorite meme from the time was this, it's like a mock-up of a text message between friends, between a mother and their kid, and it says, be yourself, and then there's a little ... and then it says, no, not like that. And I think that's the message we send a lot to our kids, right? It's the message that society sends to our kids and that we send to each other. So today the talk I wanted to give you was just about how to be yourself, but I thought it would be easier to do through the lens of an issue and how we can support communities of people in being who they are. And the issue that I wanted to choose was reconciliation with Indigenous people. So you might think a number of things about reconciliation. You might think a number of things about the word Indigenous and Indigenous peoples. My big hope today, I chose an issue. I could have chosen any number of issues, but I wanted you to inspire you to think about what happens when you create the space for people to matter, whether that's in a city, whether it's in your workplace, whether it's in your home, your children in your home, your husband, for your husband to make the space, or your wife for you to matter. the human moments, right? Because that's really, when we say reconciliation, I can write a lot of policies, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action are definitely important, but unless we make that space for someone to matter, it's impossible to get further in that discussion. So I was first elected, as you heard, to council in 2008. I really, really, really wanted to affect change on quite a large number of issues. As the mayor often reminds me, maybe too many. And I really wanted to act, but how? So consider this. We walked in here about 130 years ago. We completely trashed the place, metaphorically and literally. We trashed the people, we trashed their home, we trashed their families, we trashed their communities. And now we're like, hey, sorry about that. Could we talk? Like, how do we move to the next level on this? So we had done the Olympics. I was elected during the Olympics, but it was really people before me who had pulled together the 4 host nations framework and this sort of workable model for working between non-Indigenous governments and Indigenous governments. We've done a dialogues project, which was really incredible, where First Nations, urban Indigenous communities, refugees, and immigrants came together to talk about their shared experiences here in Vancouver, as well as their different experiences. But it was creating tiny connections, but not that space where you can make that big community eye contact and see each other for who you are. And that was the space I wanted to create. So in 2010, there was a revolutionary thing that happened called the Urban Aboriginal People Study. It was the first time in Canada's history that Indigenous people were able to study themselves. It's always about non-Indigenous people studying Indigenous people and telling other non-Indigenous people how Indigenous people feel. And UAPS was the very first time Urban Aboriginal People Study. It was led by Indigenous people, and it was conducted by Indigenous people, and they were glad that we were interested, but frankly, that's not why they did it. They did it to have a better understanding of the experiences that they were having in Canada's cities. So it came to council. I got them to come present to council. They looked at the 13 biggest cities in Canada, including Vancouver. And what I learned was that one of the main reasons we hadn't been acting on this is because the literacy was so low. People had no idea. They did not know the difference between a First Nation, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose territory we're on, and an urban Indigenous person who's just as much a settler here as I am or anyone else is here. And still, though, facing very real challenges as a result of their ethnicity, their indigeneity, but not of this territory, so also dealing with those issues. Knowing can be power, right? It's another kind of power. It's the power that I've often brought because I don't have the right chromosomes to automatically get power in politics. So knowledge is definitely a power thing in politics. So we disaggregated the data. Council agreed to pay for that. And the data for Vancouver was, it was very similar to the experiences that other Indigenous people were having. But the thing here that was, I was really going to try and get to the end before crying today. The thing that was so remarkably different here was the experience of Indigenous parents who felt that their children could never achieve as much as a non-Indigenous child, that they would be so held back by the discrimination that they experienced in our schools, in their employment, and in their lives, that they could never even aspire to achieve the kinds of things that a non-Indigenous. So you imagine that. Imagine dropping your kid off on the first day of school, believing in your heart that the opportunities that the other children in that class have will never be available to your kid, no matter how hard they work, no matter how good they are. And how, when you talk about just being and having the space to be, how awful it is that we take that away from an entire group of people, a huge thousands of people living in our city. So that moved council to do a few things. So we established an Urban Aboriginal Peoples Advisory Committee. We laid the groundwork to bring the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in 2013, which was a court-ordered process to gather the truth about what had happened in residential schools, broadly as a result of colonization, but specifically in the residential school system. In 2012, we got the TRC to agree to come to Vancouver. They really wanted to go to Victoria for a variety of reasons. But we convinced them that Vancouver was the place to be. And then we did something we'd never done, which is declared our first ever year of something in Vancouver. And that year was the Year of Reconciliation. This wasn't done in a vacuum. We had the OPO Commission report on the missing and murdered woman. Idle No More, which many of you might remember was happening that winter over 2012, 2013. So when this idea of declaring a Year of Reconciliation came to council, people were excited about it. It was a unanimous vote. It was actually a bit anticlimactic, but it sort of launched the space for people to matter in the city of Vancouver. I am very action-oriented. The idea that a proclamation with roughly 380 words is somehow going to change the world, a proclamation that just says, hey, it's the Year of Reconciliation. But I definitely am now a believer that when those words create the space for someone to matter, you can actually make that kind of change happen. So reconciliation is a big word. It's a long word, but I mean, it means many things to many different people in many different contexts. So for us, we had 3 goals that we defined to go with it. The first was to make the space for Indigenous people to speak the truth about the harm that had happened to them as a result of colonization, whether that was in a residential school as a result of the reserve system. There's a lot of intergenerational trauma from children of survivors of residential school, or children that are part of families where people didn't survive residential school. We also wanted to make the space. This might sound a bit like all reconciliation, right? So you have a fight with your partner. You need to make the space for someone to tell the truth about what happened, how they experienced that truth. Then you need to make the space for the non-Indigenous person or other partner to acknowledge that they've heard that truth, right? Because if they say it and you don't acknowledge that you've heard it, there's not a lot of space to move forward. And that's really the third thing, was to find that pathway forward. So when we started, our biggest fear was that we were opening, my biggest fear, many of our fears, was that we were going to open this door to have a discussion, and in through it would come all this ignorance and fear and racism. And of course, we're not going to be the target of that, right? It's going to be the people that we're trying to create the space to tell us about the harm that's been done. That did not happen at all. At every step of this work on reconciliation, of this work to see people, to help them matter and feel like they matter within the city, at every step, we have seen more doors open. No matter how I've had, and it's my own bias, I'll admit it, I've been on the west side and deep southwest west side and had guys of a certain age and ethnicity, white, older men, who, you're Andrea Reimer and you do that stuff on like Aboriginal or Indians or Native or whatever word, and I'm like, oh God, this is like, and you're like trying to decide, am I going to fight him? Am I just going to try and hear him? Like, how is this going to go? And then he'll say, I'm just so glad you're doing that. Like, I can't believe the awful things that have happened, right? And realizing that the truth and the knowledge really creates the space, right? But it doesn't automatically create the action. So we had to do that. Some actions were very high profile and very hard to miss. We had 70,000 people walking for reconciliation in 2013, another 80,000 who came out this last year in the 150 plus. We had 100,000 who came out to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission events, who came to hear the testimony of survivors and their family members. We have a lot of things that were not quite as visible, but I think probably more transformative. As you heard, I'm really into childcare and building childcare. We now have targets for Indigenous-focused childcare as a result, and a cultural competency video, so that no matter where Indigenous children are going to childcare, the people that are working with them have that touchstone, that knowledge that they need to feel like they can be more successful in supporting them in their culture. Housing, we have a memorandum of understanding in 4 sites totaling 1,000 units that we're working on, and supporting the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh in their aspirations to be able to build on 3 sites that they own in the city of Vancouver to build housing. We have started getting the language. The thing we hear from Indigenous, the 3 First Nations, is how difficult it is for them to have been made invisible in their own territory. And so this idea of getting the language visible again is quite profound for them in ways that I find hard to give a voice to, other than just to learn the language and try and put it back there. But getting the names back onto the land, getting the names onto buildings and streets, it's
hard to describe, but all of us came from places where things were bad or good or something. And we decided to leave to come here because we thought things would be better here. Consider that they never left. Things got so bad. And yet they never left here. And yet we just kind of erased them, right? As though they weren't even here. So anything that we can do to help them be seen to us is one of the most important things we can do. To that end, we have a carving pavilion out at Britannia Community Center. We do a lot of public art projects together because this is an important part of visibility. We did one right in council chambers so that it's right in the seat of where we make decisions. And a lot of it is just, it's a long list, but it's really the day-to-day. When we read the proclamation all through the Year of Reconciliation, and I read it at this one event, and I mean, they're pretty profound, the 380 words, but you know, on the 480th reading of it, you know, you maybe phone it in a little when you get down to the 4th or 5th paragraph. And this woman, young woman, 14-year-old woman came up to me, Indigenous young woman, afterwards, and she looked at me and she said, you know, I never knew I mattered. I didn't know I mattered to the city of Vancouver, which I find funny because I think, who wants to matter to the city of Vancouver? But for her, it meant everything in the world, right? And you think about now the possibility of her life, the trajectory, that change from being this kid whose parents statistically, because of the study we had, will likely believe this child could never do as well as another child who's not Indigenous, suddenly matters to the city of Vancouver. Suddenly this child could be mayor in the future. They could be prime minister. They could be premier. The things that they can do by mattering are so much greater than the things that they might have done by not mattering. And that's a big deal for them, but it's a big deal for us. Like, think of what we've lost by having so many people erased, having so many people made invisible and not mattering, whether Indigenous or not. I mean, we're talking about Indigenous communities, but they're not the only community or the only people within communities that we try to find ways to make less visible or to erase, or that we can find ways to make visible. So this year we did the Mount Everest of Reconciliation Challenges, which was Canada 150 plus. You can imagine the discussion that ensued in a city that's focused on reconciliation about how to deal with honoring an event which was not, it's not celebrated in Indigenous communities in the way that it's celebrated in non-Indigenous communities. And yet many of us, Indigenous or not, are proud of being Canadian. So how to make that work? So we turned it into a celebration of survival, resilience, and opportunity. We, for the first time ever, gave First Nations and Indigenous people priority in the purchasing contracts. So whether that was artists, whether it was production assistants, whether it was people doing the development work or the communications, the photography, we did an Indigenous apprenticeship program and really looked at what economic reconciliation looks like. And if we are, you know, there's the truth, there's the acknowledgement of the truth, but then there's the pathway forward together, right? We can't stay in one side of this. We have to keep moving forward. And we wanted to see what it might look like. And it felt good to be able to walk that path together this year. Some other things that I wanted to note is that since the year ended, the Year of Reconciliation, you know, we have to acknowledge that we've heard this truth. We spent a year hearing the truth. The way that we chose to acknowledge it was two things. We acknowledged that we are on the unceded traditional homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. To me, it felt like just typing down, like it's almost like copying and pasting a definition out of the dictionary. Like, this is a truth. These territories are theirs. They were never ceded. The courts have been very clear on that. The history is very clear. All parties are very clear on that. And yet it was kind of like a revolution to put those down on paper and vote on them in a council meeting, but unanimous. And I think anyone who had sat through the testimony could not have sat in that room and voted for this moment. We also created a framework for a city of reconciliation, which allows the work to move forward. So the big question is progress being made, right? What has changed as a result of that? Yes, the kid who came up to me and said that they never knew that they mattered. That is progress. It's very hard to track, though, and these are the challenges of these kinds of efforts. So when we started, we dreamed it might live beyond our borders, like maybe somebody else would do a year of reconciliation. Every major city now in Canada has done a year of reconciliation and had their own list of outcomes as a result of that. And we're continuing to build a model. Ultimately, the big pieces that need to change are federal and provincial policy. I could bore you with a long PowerPoint about municipal jurisdiction and authority under the Constitution of Canada. We're best when we're convening people and showing leadership on these issues. We don't have a lot of direct authority to make change. So we have worked to try and be those leaders and try and show what, when we believe that we have a moral imperative to act, what reconciliation can look like. So the question then that I would put to you around all of this, because we don't have the legislative authority to act on anything to do with First Nations actually under the Constitution, but we didn't believe that even if our agency ended here, does our responsibility end here? And we very clearly said, no, it does not, that we must find ways to act. So the question then is, if you don't have the agency, do you have the responsibility? Is it your job to make people matter? How do you make the space for people to just simply be? I would argue the very first person who needs to matter in your life is you. And I know this is really tough. I was elected the first time. My kid had just started kindergarten. So I was working a full-time job. My kid had just started kindergarten, and I was elected to school board as the first Green Party member in Canada. I had zero support. I was 29 years old. Apparently looked younger than most of the students in the high schools that I would go into schools and they'd be like, you're not supposed to be out of class. And I'm like, oh, I'm actually your boss. So yeah, so it was tough, right? But if you don't matter to you, it's really tough to make the case to other people that you matter. And it's impossible for you to make the space for people who aren't you to matter in your life. So that has to be number one for all of these things to happen. The other thing, if reconciliation is going to be successful, we need to understand, and this is the last thing that I will say, is that it's not something that we're doing for someone or to someone. This is not about, us good non-Indigenous people helping out Indigenous or non-Indigenous helping out Indigenous. We all are diminished when we make someone invisible, right? As I said, the opportunities that all of us have lost by diminishing those people, those children, those adults, whoever they are profound. We'll never know what they were, but it's the past. What we can change is the future. And I'd really invite you, if you're not already active on issues around reconciliation, to get engaged. But as I said, very first step I would invite you to is find ways to reconcile with yourself, whatever that looks like for you. Thank you. Hi, Jeff.